Hello, this is Kenneth L. Marcus, founder, chairman, and CEO of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. Welcome to today's webinar on the explosion and evolution of anti-Semitism with Jonathan Segal. We will be joined later in the hour also by my colleague Alyza Lewin of the Louis D. Brandeis Center. This session is part of a series of webinars that we provide for the public on issues relating to the mission of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, which is to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. We are probably best known for our work on college campuses, fighting anti-Semitism through law and public policy. However, in recent years, as anti-Semitism has seeped from the campus to other sectors, including K-12, health, and the corporate world, we have addressed anti-Semitism where we have seen it and where we need to be. We have, for example, held a number of webinars and other events dealing with this topic of anti-Semitism in the workplace. Our prior webinars that are on the YouTube channel for the Louis D. Brandeis Center include, among others, some background provided in webinars by Andrea Lucas, who now serves as the interim chair of the EEOC, and also Keith Sonderling, who currently serves as the Deputy Secretary of Labor of the United States. Today, we are especially pleased to bring back Jonathan Segal, a longtime friend of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, who is one of the leading experts on employment law in the country, especially as it pertains to discrimination issues such as anti-Semitism. Jonathan is a really distinguished expert. He is a partner in the law firm of Duane Morris LLP in the Employment, Labor, Pensions, and Immigration Practice Group. He is also the founder and managing principal of the Duane Morris Institute, which provides training for human resource professionals, in-house counsel, benefits administrators, and managers at Duane Morris at client sites and by way of webinars on myriad employment, labor benefits, and immigration matters. So we're very pleased to have him. I'll also say that his extensive honors and awards include really many, if not all, of the sorts of honors that one might have in his field. He has been a law dragon leading U.S. corporate employment lawyer for several years, listed in Chambers, a fellow of the American Bar Foundation. He's been listed as an influencer of law, been named one of the Human Resource Executive's top 100 most powerful attorneys, and on. Most influential people in HR and recruiting on Twitter list. 100 most powerful employment lawyers. He certainly is one of the most highly regarded employment lawyers in the country. And we're so pleased generally that he has had such a focus on the issue of anti-Semitism, and in particular that he is amenable to sharing his expertise with us. I see already that we have a substantial audience online. Of course, we will be joined in the future by those seeing us non-synchronously. But for those of you who are watching in real time, feel free to use the Q&A function to provide questions that we will hope to get to afterwards. For now, I'm delighted to welcome my friend, our colleague, truly a lawyer's lawyer in this field, Jonathan Segal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's going to be hard to live up to those kind words. I'll just say it's a genuine honor to be here. I respect so much what the Brandeis Center has done and will do, not only in the college university space, but also with regard to employment, etc. I'm going to try in the next 40 minutes max to cover with you maybe 3 hours of material. So if okay with you, I'm going to pause in some areas and suggest some possible additional reading or thoughts, but not go into everything that we potentially could go into today. I am a lawyer, need to say, not legal advice pertaining to specific factual situations. Disclaimer aside, let me begin. When we think about anti-Semitism, and as Ken kindly mentioned, my practice focuses heavily on preventing discrimination and harassment. And over the last 5 years, with a more focus on religion and in particular anti-Semitism, we've seen an explosion of anti-Semitism outside the workplace. And we'll talk about the impact on the workplace. Just some statistics to sort of set the table. In the Anti-Defamation League has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents for 46 years. And 2024 broke the record from 2023, the highest number of anti-Semitic harassment, violence, and assaults in the history since the ADL has been recording such incidents. Really the highest number since the Holocaust. And by all measures, I think it's reasonable to believe that 2025, the numbers will be higher, or said otherwise worse, than 2024. There's some statistics from the FBI, and they're also disconcerting, but important in talking about this explosion of anti-Semitism. In the US, Jews account for only 2% of the US population, yet we count for 15% of all hate crimes. We talk about representation. We're overrepresented as Jews when it comes to hate crimes. So what does it mean for something to be anti-Semitic? And there are books, there are discussion groups. We could spend hours on this, but let me begin focusing on the workplace only and acknowledging a broader definition may apply outside the workplace. General definition: prejudice, violence, hostility, discrimination, harassment directed at the Jewish religion, those practicing it, and or the Jewish people. And there's a difference there. You could have discrimination against someone because they observe Shabbat or because they were Orthodox Jewish, and that would be based on their religion, their ritual. But there also could be bias against the Jewish people that has nothing to do necessarily with religious observance or practice, but bias against the Jewish people as a people. And one of the things that I've studied and see is, unfortunately in real life, often in social media, is this notion of a conspiracy theory involving Jewish individuals. We are defined as less than, but somehow are in charge of or trying to control the banks, the world, etc., for our benefit or to hurt others. Bret Stephens of the New York Times, previously of the Wall Street Journal, someone I quote a lot, refers to it as punching up. This idea that Jews are less than, but somehow nefariously and powerfully in control. So if we did a history of anti-Semitism, a lot of it began with hatred toward Jewish people because of their faith or because they weren't Christian, they weren't Muslim. We've seen in more recent years the hatred toward the Jewish people as a people or seen as a race, including during the Holocaust. As another person I'd like to read and quote, Douglas Murray, anti-Semitism is very much a shape-shifting virus. Well, it seems to be shifting again. And the question is, what about anti-Zionism? Let me talk about the Anti-Defamation League statistics again. 58% of the incidents reported by the ADL in that 2024 study were Israel related. That same trend is going to occur in 2025. I suspect that number will be even higher. And there are some very high profile cases that I think we're all aware of where antipathy, hostility toward Israel was manifested itself in the attempt to assassinate or successful murder of individuals in the US without necessarily any connection to their role with Israel. The attempted arson of the residence of the governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, on Passover. An interfaith couple, these are all just from this year, murdered leaving the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. Need to say their names, Lashinsky and Milgram. And important to note, Mr. Lashinsky was not Jewish, a Christian man, that anti-Semitism hurts and kills not only Jews, but also others. Setting on fire of Jewish protesters, peacefully calling for the release of the Israeli hostages by Hamas in Boulder, Colorado. I need to say, when I looked at all of these incidents, and I think about the impact they have on the workplace, I had trouble sleeping the night after number 3. And it wasn't just because of my heart breaking for the individuals who were set on fire, but also because of my own family, the history I bring and what I bring into a workplace with me. Most likely my great grandfather was set on fire. We're not 100% sure, but was set on fire for the crime of being Jewish. So there are literally hundreds of other examples of Jewish individuals in grocery stores and auto shops who've been attacked. And like these examples, when the attacks occurred, things have been said like Free Palestine, long live the Intifada, Israel is engaging in genocide, negative comments, to say the least, about Israel in general and or the war in Gaza in particular. So the question that leads us to is Israel-related anti-Semitism. And I want to start with the premise that criticism of Israel is not in and of itself anti-Semitism. However, it can morph into anti-Semitism in many different ways. And I just want to give you the primary example of where I see it existing in the workplace. From the examples that we saw, the tragic examples, criticism of Israel morphs into anti-Semitism when Jews writ large are blamed, or much worse, killed for actual or perceived wrongs of the Israeli government. This nexus is where I have seen, among other areas, anti-Israeli fervor manifest itself as anti-Semitism in the workplace. And we'll talk about where that fits under the legal structure. So with that background, what I've done, Ken, and I hope it's not hubris, is for this discussion, my own working definition of anti-Semitism: prejudice, hostility, discrimination, harassment, or violence directed at Jewish people because of their faith, the D and the H you can see in the workplace, discrimination, harassment, as a people, something I've learned from the Brandeis Center, the idea of an ethno-religion and under Title VI, or because of actual or perceived connections to Israel. For those of you that are interested, there's a broader definition of anti-Semitism to which many of us subscribe, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I'll put that in the chat afterward, which many organizations, governments, states, etc. have adopted. But at a minimum, I don't think we can look at anti-Semitism as it relates to the workplace and ignore point 3, Jewish people being discriminated against, harassed because of actual or perceived connections to Israel. I want to pause there for a moment before I go into the law and how this background applies to it. But before I do, are there any quick questions or thoughts I should anything I should answer or clarify? Okay. Ken?
Jonathan, we have a number of questions that have been coming in, but I'm not sure that any of them require sort of stopping things. I think that you've been clear and none of the questions indicate a lack of clarity.
Okay. So the questions tell me I have to be succinct with my words so we have time to answer them. So let's talk about anti-Semitism at work. If someone is racist, they don't shed that at the workplace door. If someone is sexist, they don't shed that at the workplace door. If someone is homophobic, all these general truisms, the same thing is true of anti-Semitism. So some bias exists in workplaces against individuals who are Jewish, and it could be discriminating against them because of their being Jewish, harassing them, separating them, failing to accommodate them, or retaliating against them for opposing anti-Semitism. We're going to focus on discrimination and harassment. And the protection for employers need to keep in mind, and individuals who may be watching as applicants or employees, is that individuals who are Jewish may be protected under Title VII, the employment statute, different from Title VI, which deals with colleges and universities, among others, and students. Under Title VII, an individual who's discriminated against because they're Jewish could claim religious discrimination, even if they're secular, not necessarily observant. There are cases that say under Title VII, borrowing from Title VI language, that it could be an ethno-religion, so discriminating against someone because they're Jewish as a people. It could be direct national origin discrimination because they are Israeli, that in and of itself, you don't need to make a broader nexus to anti-Semitism. There are some cases that say anti-Semitism can be race discrimination or even genetic information discrimination. Real important to know that Ken referred to Acting Chair Andrea Lucas. She has made clear that one of her top priorities is religious liberty in general and combating anti-Semitism in the workplace in particular. And this year, the EEOC had the largest settlement of a case involving a prestigious university for the case settled, so no finding was made, but the allegations were tolerating harassment of individuals because they were Jewish, with a $21 million settlement. In response, on LinkedIn, the acting or interim chair, Lucas, posted, "Here at the EEOC, we're serious about combating anti-Semitism, and we're just getting started." So let me get started with telling you the 5 areas where, if you are an employer, you should be thoughtful about making sure you're not ignoring, and we'll talk about a bit prevention. Number 1, blatant animus against Jews. The individuals that post comments about Jews on X and other social media sites, and I'm not talking about bots. People often describe, who are they? They're employees, and they're in workplaces. And we should not assume that blatant animus, hatred toward Jews, does not exist. Sadly, it's morphed in terms of, it's gotten more accepted, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 2, the stereotyping about Jews. I remember when someone called me and said, "I'm looking for you to handle a case." And at first I thought, well, that's flattering. And then they said, "We're looking for a Jewish lawyer. You know what I mean." My response was, "I know what you mean. I'm a lawyer who is Jewish, but I'm not going to be your lawyer." The idea that somehow there would be something shady or less ethical. In the name of equity, I worry sometimes when organizations talk about, besides the illegality of saying we want to we want 20% of our workplace is X, we want 20% of our managers to be X. There are DEI problems with that. But I also want to mention that when people talk about equity and underrepresentation, there's a problem with that in terms of what may be overrepresentation. And in particular, Jews and Asian Americans, sometimes in the context of DEI, can face bias when there is this myopic focus on representation. Someone having shared with me and having seen documentation would love to hire you, but there are too many Cohens in management. It doesn't take a jury consultant, and that didn't go to a jury, to see the issue there. Number 4, I have nothing against Jews per se, which when it begins with that, I always get a little nervous. It's just Israel or Zionism where I have a problem. And then, of course, that person gets swept into their anti-Zionist views. Again, people of good faith can be critical of and disagree on Israel. Big fan and robust discussion. But, and it's a big but, in contemporary anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is almost always anti-Semitism. So if you're not going to hire a Zionist for a job because of their ideology, you're going to make someone sign a pledge anti-Israel, that will have an adverse impact on the vast majority of Americans who are Jewish, identify as Zionists, and I want to say on Christian allies too, or failure to make accommodations on behalf of Jewish applicants or employees. These are 5 general areas. I just want to focus, time permitting, on one. How bad is the stereotyping? Well, in 2024, the ADL did another survey, and they had a bunch of tropes about Jewish folks. And they asked people, do you agree with them? Now, my sense is that there are people who have bias who won't admit it, but still have it. So whatever numbers come up, whether the issue be race, sex, etc., same thing, religion, I suspect the numbers are higher. According to this Anti-Defamation League survey of 2024, 38% of those interviewed thought Jews like to be the head of things. 26% have too much power in the business world, too many Cohens. Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what they want, 23%. I'm looking for a Jewish lawyer, and you know what I mean. Why do I emphasize this? Because when I look at my passion is prevention. There is a need for litigation. I respect it. But I'd always rather see things avoided rather than litigated where possible. And employers, in my view, should be doing even more to address religious discrimination in general and anti-Semitism in particular. I've seen many training programs that employers have put together where they talk about, as a compliance matter, as a cultural matter, you can't discriminate based on, and it's strong and it's heartfelt and it's correct, based on race and sex, it goes on. And then it's shtim, it's silent when it comes to religion in general and anti-Semitism in particular. If you are an employer and your management training program is silent on religious bias and discrimination based on an anti-Semitism in particular, that's a major compliance gap, which could have legal consequences. And I would recommend that employers consider calling out anti-Semitism in particular when they do this management training. After 9/11, while I thought most responded in a lofty way, there were some who spewed hatred toward Muslim Americans. At that time, I recommended calling out anti-Muslim bias because that was the house on fire, if you will. The house on fire now is the Jewish house. I think that needs to be addressed in training, and I think we would be naive to assume this bias doesn't occur. To the extent in training, to the extent employers have DEI training, you need to make clear representation creates legal ish, but overrepresentation is a problem. To the extent you're doing management training more generally, you want to make clear the potentially broad definition of anti-Semitism. So it's not only animus against the faith, A, against the people, B, or because of an actual or perceived connection to Israel, having nothing to do with the workplace. I was at a wedding a couple weekends ago, and something I noticed that I didn't think about until last night was a beautiful church wedding. No one said, I felt very comfortable, no reason I wouldn't. And then at the table, we started talking about world events. I did my best to change the topic. I failed. And then it got to the issue of Israel. And I said, I feel strongly that Israel has a right to defend itself. I also care and worry about the people of Gaza. There are a lot of heartfelt feelings. maybe this isn't the best topic for us to discuss at dinner. Now, my comment, which I was hopefully balanced, was in response to some unbalanced comments. Later, people kind of avoided me, and I showered, so it wasn't because I smelled. I wonder whether someone in the workplace that speaks up, if they're going to be subject to some modest, and again, I'm not making it into a big deal, but we have to look at sometimes the discrimination also can be an avoidance. So clear recommendation for employers, hit the issue head on of discrimination based on religion, focus of the EEOC, focus of mine, focus of the Brandeis Center, should be a focus of yours. I also want to recommend strongly that you focus on harassment. And what I've done is I've pulled together examples of expressions that have come from one of three sources. One, cases I've handled in counseling. Two, cases I've read about, including court cases. Or three, things I've seen on, I don't mean to keep picking on X, but I've seen on X, formerly known as Twitter, examples. One would be calling for the death of or violence against Jews. Go onto some social media sites, you will see individuals with unhinged hatred toward Jewish people. And for me, in my view, when someone says, I don't hate Jews, I just want to see all Zionists die, Zionist in 2025 is a proxy for Jews. I was on a panel and someone said, I'm not sure it's necessarily a proxy for Jews. And I said, well, let's say it's not necessarily a proxy for Jews. It's close enough that wishing death on all of the group is not okay. Hate words should be obvious. The K word. Hate symbols should be obvious, such as a swastika. In 2025, no one would have a swastika in their workplace, except for the employee that went into the locker room and there was a swastika on his locker. Stereotypical comments about the Jews, about Jewish people. An individual made a comment about in her workplace that she was concerned about anti-Semitism generally, to which she was met with a comment, well, I don't know why anti-Semitism you think is such a problem. You folks control the media. Why don't you just make anti-Semitism go away? Now, I asked to see the person's notes, and I know it's only their notes, to see that. This conspiracy again, that Jews were coordinated together, the cabal from the protocol of the elders of Zion. We can't agree how to spell Rosh Hashanah. I can guarantee you we're not in a cabal to control the world, but yet when you look, you see some of that. And in the tragic, and it is tragic killing of Charlie Kirk, there's already being some anti-Semitic venom throwing that somehow the Jewish people were responsible. I don't know where it comes from, but it's a virus that continues every 90 years to flourish, or 100 years, and we're there now. Jokes in quotes about Jews, the misogyny of Jewish American princess jokes, the case about where an employee in her workplace was called Little Anne Frank. Now, when I go through these, Ken, for me, sometimes it's hard to believe they happened because I can't master someone dragging their knuckles so low in 2025. But we know that racism happens. We know that sexism happens. Anti-Semitism happens too. But one of the things that sometimes I think may be a bit different is when someone talks about racism, and it's a person of color, I do think it's important to listen to their perspective. When a woman talks about sexism, I do think it's important to listen to her perspective. When someone gay talks about homophobia, but I can't tell you how many times I and others, in conversations with people in good faith, have been told, well, that's not anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, I think the same, subject to reasonableness, subject to treating it no different from, no less than, no more than race, sex, homophobia, have to look at how would Jewish people likely feel or respond. Holocaust denial, distortion, and misuse. There are many reasons potentially for the rise in anti-Semitism. And I always get nervous in discussing reasons because then that may suggest there's a legitimate reason for it. There is none, full stop. I get nervous when I hear people say, not necessarily with bad faith, but I call it out so you don't make the comment. Well, if only Israel didn't do X, we wouldn't have the anti-Semitism. History proves that wrong. There is a horrible history of anti-Semitism for thousands of years, often referred to as the oldest form of hatred. The Holocaust, for many, I think, at least I would see it as sort of the pinnacle of where the hatred resulted in workplace orchestrated concentration camps to eliminate Jews. And when people think about the Holocaust, well, that couldn't have happened. How could there be industrial genocide? That's why many of us who are Jewish don't like the word genocide being used on Israel, even if we have concerns about certain actions, people being put into ovens, etc. In workplaces, seen jokes about the Holocaust, denial that the Holocaust existed, referring to any other wrong in the world. It doesn't have to rise to the Holocaust to be wrong as a Holocaust. I would suggest that denial, distortion, and misuse of the Holocaust can create a hostile environment for someone who is Jewish, or I would mention for others too. And then we get to what may be one of the hardest areas. You'll recall that I said that I thought there were generally the three-headed monster of anti-Semitism, as I see it, bias against Jewish people because of their faith, bias against Jewish people as a people because of traits that are associated with them. And then the third category is bias against Jewish people because of their actual or perceived connection with Israel and the current hostilities in Gaza. So how could that relate to a workplace? Question. I just need to go back to one slide on the Holocaust. Conversations about world events, again, are not anti-Semitic, but denying Holocaust denial, Hamas denial, at a very minimum, that will make, among others, Jews uncomfortable, unacceptable in the workplace. And we'll talk about that legal standard in a moment. Israel-Palestine focused questions or other comments. The individual who came to work, and whenever there was something from a particular publication that kind of fact-checked afterward, would put something on, someone would put on his desk something negative about Israel. What's the message when you come into workplace and someone doesn't even have the courage to say to you, I don't like what Israel's doing, but why would that be put on the Jewish employee's desk? Because going back to what I said about 15 minutes ago, this conflation, blaming Jewish people for actual or perceived wrongs by the Israeli government. The employee who went into a discussion and it began with, in light of what your people went through, you can't, well, I can stop right there. You can't agree with the Israeli government. Well, this person checked his credentials and he wasn't a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Those kinds of conversations in a workplace, at a minimum, create division and can be hurtful and harmful. But let's just spend a moment. An employee, and I have to acknowledge, I had so many wonderful professors. When I think about them, I get very excited. But some of my best professors always said, we all have a bias somewhere. But I'm going to tell you my bias. So I want to tell you my bias in favor of free speech. But in a workplace, anti-harassment laws, by definition, curb free speech. The idea is that when you say something that reasonably could offend someone because of their membership in a protected group, race, sex, color, religion, national origin, pregnancy, sexual orientation, etc., there's a potential, if not a problem there. Not saying anti-Semitism should be any more, but I'm saying it shouldn't be any less. So I don't know if we can do this in the chat without my bringing the entire Zoom down, but I'm going to give it a shot. An employee who's a manager posts on we'll do Instagram, LinkedIn, you pick it, Free Palestine. Is that a problem? Let me go into the chat room. Can we do chat? Will that work? If you think it's a high problem, give it a 3. You're not sure, a 2. Probably okay, 1. Or people are now responding in the comments. 3, chat is disabled. Okay, the chat's disabled, my fault. So I'm going to skip the chat, although I love having dialogue. I'm sorry that I didn't realize that. Let me tell you how I analyze Free Palestine, and I welcome different responses to it. The EEOC, following court cases, has said, I believe correctly, in determining whether conduct is objectively offensive, we should look for a reasonable person in the complainant's protected group. And again, I like thinking of it, let's go back to Me Too, that many men learned that things that would not necessarily offend them might offend many women. So the question wasn't, would it offend you as a man, but could it reasonably offend a woman? And there's a reasonableness requirement. I think the same thing would be true here. I've shared before this analogy. I've seen some employers say, if someone says free Palestine or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, we should ignore that because it's just speech. Don't agree, because the K word is just speech. And in the workplace, at least in the private sector, there are not the same speech rights as there are in the government, where there's the First Amendment. And in both cases, we need to look at harassment. There are some that would say, well, that could offend someone, so it's Jewish, so it's per se anti-Semitic. I don't go there either. This is how I analyze this issue. And I go back to something that doesn't involve, I tend to do this a fair amount, another area. There were a series of issues involving the display of the Confederate flag in the workplace. And in social media, that display might be on Instagram. And the question was, what does that mean? And the EEOC said it's the heritage hatred controversy. That for some, it may sincerely be felt as a demonstration or manifestation of Southern pride, but it reasonably could be heard or felt by someone African American, or in my case, white, as an endorsement of slavery. That intent versus impact, we don't need to call it racist. We just need to say it's unacceptable in the workplace because it could reasonably make someone of color uncomfortable, someone Black uncomfortable. That's how I see free Palestine, and maybe from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So when I got a case involving an employee who posted that, and the coworkers were upset, ignoring the complaint would be a problem. I thought terminating, and again, I'm changing the facts a bit because facts always matter, might be a bit strong. But how about saying by analogy, you may intend solidarity with the Palestinian people. This reasonably could be heard as no Israel. There are other ways that you can express it that don't have that adverse impact. The same way you can express Southern pride without the Confederate flag, you can express solidarity with the Palestinian people without using these kinds of expressions. It's a construct that I like to use in focusing on these because I've seen it applied, in my view, faithfully and correctly on sexism and on racism. And to me, it would apply here. So I don't, on a personal level, I struggle a little more with number 3, globalize the intifada. I'm having more trouble finding, if you will, the okay intent when it's globalize the intifada, which I hear is attack Jews. But I think the reason I'm raising this is on these issues, we need to be thoughtful about impact on Jewish people. We also need to be thoughtful about culture. And we don't necessarily want to always assume that everything is cause for discipline or termination. And we also want to be thoughtful about the kind of culture we have in an organization. What does this mean for you? Please, I have looked at so many online harassment programs, and I often will say, I've been asked to review them for a client or a city or state requires it, and there is nothing. I'll teach you a Yiddish word, gornisht, not a word on anti-Semitism. There's appropriate examples on racism and sexism, etc., but not a word on anti-Semitism. Not okay in 2025 when we see the level of anti-Semitism that exists today. Think about including in your training examples of anti-Semitism. I called it a three-headed monster. You could, in 3 minutes, talk about an anti-Semitic example based on the faith, based on the people, based on the nexus to Israel, actual or perceived. If you're an employee, and I'm not giving advice to employers or employees, and it's absent, ask the question. Ask, how does this apply? If you're in HR and you're not covering anti-Semitism, please be ready because that question may be coming. I have a colleague who is doing training, and what he said to me was he went to cover anti-Semitism in the talking points. Important to say. You don't have to be Black to be offended by racism. You don't have to be a woman to be offended by sexism. You don't have to be Jewish to be offended by anti-Semitism. He is a Christian man, and he got pushback and said, well, this is a controversial issue. There is nothing controversial about condemning anti-Semitism. There is legitimate debate on the war in Gaza. Good faith people have different views, but to conflate that with and suggest that to condemn anti-Semitism, one needs to give another side. There is no other side to anti-Semitism. And I've heard that from one person. I've had a conversation very similar to that on my own. Besides dealing with this in your training, deal with this in social media, because a lot of the venom is likely to come there. Make sure your harassment policy references social media, your social media policy references harassment, so that people are on notice that what they post there may be considered by the employer. And then, as an employer, if an employee is engaging in bad conduct that reasonably may be perceived, notice that word reasonable, as anti-Semitic, you got to respond proportionately and promptly. A quote joke about Jewish control in and of itself does not rise to the level of a hostile work environment under federal law, severe or pervasive. Probably not even in New York, where it's just treated less than standard. But as we say with race and sex and age and disability and orientation, we shouldn't wait as employers until it reaches the level of unlawful harassment. If it's harassing, even if unlawful, we should respond to it promptly and proportionately. And you don't need to use the word anti-Semitic. You can simply say it's unacceptable because it stereotypes Jewish people, because it's hostile to the Jewish faith. In my experience, sometimes the corrective action is light based on free speech concerns that are not raised to other levels of harassment. And that's something I think organizations need to look at the facts of each case, but then think big picture, what have I done in other situations? I want to just raise one last issue, Ken, and then we'll open up for questions and hopefully some answers. A real important part of this as leaders is, what do you do? And I see leaders sometimes, and it makes me sad because I don't assume bad intent. I don't know if it's allowed in 2025, but I still go through the world with the view that grace matters, and I don't assume bad motive if someone's speech doesn't immediately hit me well. But please be careful if you're condemning anti-Semitism to avoid the whataboutisms. I condemn anti-Semitism, but I also condemn the war in Gaza. That can become slippery slope to somehow saying that the Jews are that Jews are causing the anti-Semitism. Or I condemn anti-Semitism, but I also condemn Islamophobia. We should condemn Islamophobia without condemning anti-Semitism when that's the issue. When anti-Semitism is the issue, we should condemn that without referencing Islamophobia. We don't do the and with racism, sexism, etc., and we shouldn't where that's the issue. I myself have done this with anti-Semitism. I don't like it kind of pitting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as against each other. To me, they're two sides of the same coin, unacceptable bias. And then the one that I struggle with the most, even trying to keep a high view of it, is the what about the Middle East? What about Islamophobia? What about me? You're lucky if this is the first time you've experienced that. You've had a privileged life. That one was directed at me in not a work setting. It was hard for me to respond with civility, but I did. But I begin with, maybe that person didn't have bad intent. Maybe that person didn't realize what they were saying. I believe there's a place for employers to be punitive and to terminate or to discipline. But I also believe there's an important opportunity for us to discuss and educate. And when we don't believe or assume bad intent, to say, this is what you said, but here's how it felt, and this is why it's of concern to me. Give the person the chance, will often self-correct. Okay, Ken, I left 10 minutes, which for me is almost good.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was beyond good. This was extremely helpful and valuable. So thank you. We will also be joined in a moment by my colleague, Alyza Lewin, president of the Brandeis Center. She is joining us from abroad. We've had some technical difficulty with international transmission, but I think we can have her at least audio joining us. Let me say first, beyond the congratulations, the Brandeis Center is available to support employees who have any of the challenges that Jonathan has described with their employers. That is to say, we do handle anti-Semitism in the workplace, but not just employees, also labor union members who have concerns about anti-Semitism from their union, the other kind of workplace discrimination that we deal with. Jonathan, you distinguished, if I heard right, between the speech rights that um, people might have in public universities versus the different context with private workplaces. But some employees work for public institutions. And among those public institutions, some of them are not academic institutions governed by academic freedom. So, could you just say a word? I think that much of your talk was focused on the laws and the rights that apply in the private corporate workplace, but some of our audience work in other contexts.
Yeah, thank you for helping me clarify that. If someone works for the government, then their First Amendment rights would apply. But in order for someone's First Amendment rights to apply, it would have to be an issue of public concern. The Middle East, for example, could be. But then there's a balancing test. It's not automatically protected where it is in or affects the workplace. The question is, what would the impact be on the workplace in terms of either disruption or potentially creating claims against the employer? So there would be, on the speech issue, more there would be more caution would need to be taken if something was connected to the Middle East, if it were a public employer such as the government than a private employer. Thank you for asking that.
Sure. Now, thank you, Jonathan. Before I turn to Alyza, one of the audience members asked whether the slides would be made available. What we customarily do is make the recording of these events available on the Louis D. Brandeis Center YouTube channel. And if speakers care to provide their slides, we do that on YouTube typically also. Are you amenable to that, Jonathan?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Alyza, Lewin, can you hear me? And do you have either a comment or a question to share in the remaining minutes?
Yes, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Jonathan, for a terrific presentation, and glad to at least have been able to join you by audio, if not by video. One additional comment, really, when you talked about both the issue of kind of grappling with the free Palestine or from the river to the sea, and the way you categorized understanding, right, the hostility to the Jewish people or the Jewish faith, I do think that when you talked about the need for education, one of the things that's key in the workplace is being able to educate folks that Jews focus, right, on and define their Judaism and what it means to be Jewish in many different ways. For many Jews, right, it's all about religious practice. Certainly for Orthodox Jews, it's about religious practice. But for many Jews, that's not the key way that they define their Jewishness. But for most Jews, what they will say is that they feel that they're part of the Jewish people. And a key part of what that means is that they view the Jewish people as having a shared history and heritage, a shared common, ancestry. And that history, that heritage, is rooted in the land of Israel, as you say, because you talked about the connection to the land. And one of the things that we see, sadly, today is a kind of an increased effort to erase and deny that history and that heritage. And so if you look not only at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA or IRA definition of anti-Semitism, but in 2010, the State Department adopted a definition of anti-Semitism. That was 6 years before the IRA definition was issued. And in that 2010 State Department definition, which is pretty much almost word for word identical to the IRA definition, it was based on a precursor to the IRA definition. One of the examples of anti-Semitism is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by suggesting that Israel has no right to exist. The IRA definition modified that to denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by suggesting Israel is a racist endeavor. But if you understand, as you were suggesting, the Free Palestine or the From the River to the Sea as a statement saying that Israel has no right to exist, one of the reasons why I would suggest that that could be understood as anti-Semitic is because of the first part of the sentence, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. If you understand that the Jews are not just defined by religious practice, but are a people with an ancient history in the land of Israel, they're basically, the Jews are indigenous to Judea, then from that stems a right to self-determination in some borders of the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. So to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination in any borders of their ancestral homeland is at its core to deny that the Jews are a people and to deny that the Jews have any history in the land of Israel. And that's why I think it actually goes to the core of how many people define what it means to be Jewish and how Jews have defined Jewishness for millennia, as opposed to just being a political statement. And you're right? What the IRA definition says is criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize the policies of the government of Israel. But if you're going to deny that the Jews are a people or that they have any history in the land of Israel, that is a form of anti-Semitism. And we do need to educate folks to understand that Judaism is an ethno-religion and that there's a historic ancestral component to it so that they can then understand how these things land as targeting Jews on the basis of their Jewishness as opposed to being political debates.
Thank you, Alyza. We have 1 minute left, Jonathan, if you wanted to respond or comment.
Other than I agree and so eloquently said, I've heard people say I'm not anti-Jewish. When people start with that, I always get very nervous. But I'm anti-Zionist. They say, well, what does it mean to be anti-Zionist? Well, I don't think there should be an Israel. Israel shouldn't have existed, shouldn't exist. They go back to 1948. I said, if I said to you, look, I love the French people, but there shouldn't be France. And I'm not saying they're identical, but the ethno-religion. I love the Spanish people, but no Spain. I think everyone would say, are you nuts? When I hear, the idea that Israel should not exist, to me, again, I like to look at parallels in other areas, and I appreciate the much more eloquent explanation that was just given on it. But I think that's why it's so important to have education, and so many people don't understand what it means to be Jewish. More than one definition, many different meanings. The history of anti-Semitism didn't get to it in this particular webinar, and I apologize for that, only on time. But I will say, as my last thought, education, education, education. Did a program with someone who spoke on the history of anti-Semitism, talked a little bit about some of the issues that we just heard, and people came out saying, I never kind of thought of it that way. And I think with education, a lot of these problems can be minimized, if not avoided.
Jonathan Segal, thank you for your time with us. Extremely helpful. Thank you for all that you do on these issues. Alyza Lewin, thank you for joining us from abroad. We thank all who joined us in this audience, and as I indicated, hope soon to have this available on our YouTube channel. Take care, everybody.